Booksellers was right down my wheelhouse. I lived in New York most of the 1980s, and I go back at least once a year, and I always make a beeline for the few bookstores that are remaining in New York City. I was delighted that this film, The Booksellers, and granted, it covers a lot more than the few remaining bookstores in New York City. It actually covers a lot more than I expected it to cover. It went into the details about the antiquarian book trade and dealership and how those guys are surviving in the age of the internet. And we'll get to that, I'm sure. But just on a basic personal level, two of the bookstores that they spent some time in the documentary are bookstores very near and dear to my heart that are still alive and well in New York City. I want to first start with the Argosy Bookstore on East 59th Street, which is a block from Bloomingdale's, a bookstore that has been there since 1925, but I only stumbled across it really recently. I didn't know about it during the 8 years I lived in New York City, but as a tourist, I stumbled across it. I think my wife and daughter were in Bloomingdale's, and I just saw this bookstore, and I went into it, and it began this obsession, this love affair with that bookstore. A few years ago, the New Yorker, Janet Malcolm, wrote a long profile of the three sisters who run the Argosy Bookstore. They're the Cohen sisters, and you remember that, I'm sure, from the documentary. They're very lovely. They're all under 70s. Judith, Naomi, and Adina. And I go to the Argosy every time in New York. I'll show you what I picked up at the Argosy. I always have to start off with show and tell. I think it was the sister Naomi. Each of those three sisters has a specialty at the Argosy Bookstore, which the documentary went into. The one that excited me was the autograph room, which is on the top floor. You may remember that the interviewer asked the three sisters, how have they managed to stay in business all these years since 1925, when their father started the business? And their answer was quite simple. It's the same answer, which explains why the Strand bookstore is still operating, because the owners own the building. So otherwise, I think those bookstores would have been sandblasted a long time ago. But because they own the building, it enables them to survive. I went to the Argosy a few years ago with one thing in mind. I wanted to spend some money there. And it is easy to spend money in these places. My favorite writer is Thomas Berger, and probably my favorite book is Little Big Man, which was written in the early 1960s. You may be more familiar with the Dustin Hoffman movie. The book is miles and miles better than the movie. And I went to the Argosy Bookstore. We're not going to go into money right now, so don't ask me how much I paid for any of this. Besides, my wife is sitting very close and she might hit me. But I bought a first edition of Little Big Man at the Argosy Bookstore on the first floor in the rare book collection. But in the autograph section, I spent about 30 minutes alone with Adina Cohen, who runs the place. And I asked her if there was anything that she had in her collection that she could sell me that was written, like a letter or autograph from Thomas Berger. And I came away with this beautiful letter from Thomas Berger, written before Little Big Man was even published in the early 1960s, written on a manual typewriter. You can see even has the Little Big Man insignia, because the book was about to be published, and he signed his name at the bottom, Tom Berger. So I was very excited. You may remember that in the documentary, the guy that, what was his name? Dave Bergman, the guy who rides his bike to the bookstore and deals with really large books. He plays softball 7 days a week, so he can't be that busy, but you may remember him. But he has a great line in the movie where he says, The excitement of this trade is the discovery, the hunt and discovery of something you're looking for, the adventure of looking. And, I always go through that when I go to the Argosy Bookstore. After getting my Thomas Berger book and letter, I ended up getting other things, which I had no intention of getting when I was there. I ended up walking away with an autographed playbill for Alan Bates' Broadway play Butley, because I wanted Alan Bates' signature. And I love that play Butley. And I walked away with that. And last but not least, if that wasn't enough to spend money on, I came away with vintage postcards from the Hoover Dam right after the Hoover Dam was built. Now, I did not go to the Argosy Bookstore to look for Hoover Dam postcards, but, that's the kind of store it is. So I was really excited that the movie spent time with Argosy. And if you ever go to New York and you're on East 59th Street, please go to it. When I lived in New York City, I lived a few blocks from the Strand bookstore, and that's really the bookstore that I spent most of my time in. The documentary makes a point that 4th Avenue, which is where the Strand is, used to be known as Book Row. And at one time, she said that in the 1950s, there were something like 379 bookstores in New York City, and about 40 to 50 of those were on Book Row, which is on 4th Avenue, right below Strand. And I remember living in New York in the early 1980s. It was 5 minutes away from where I lived, and I would spend most of my time at the Strand, but I would go down Book Row, which doesn't exist anymore. But at that time, there were about 15 of those bookstores still making a go of it. And as Fran Lebowitz says in the documentary, she talks about those bookstores, and she said that she always felt she was intruding on these old, dusty Jewish guys who ran those bookstores, who, when she would ask them a question, do you have this book, they would look up as if she had offended them. I remember that very well, going to those bookstores, and I was frightened to ask those guys anything. But that's why this movie touched me in so many ways. And it says there's still 75 to 80 bookstores in New York, which I have a hard time believing, but they must be there somewhere. So I really love the parts about the old New York and the book trade. But I found very, very interesting just the whole idea about collecting and how people are obsessed with collecting and how it's almost a dying breed. I also like very much Rebecca Romney, I think was her name. She was the young lady who appears on pawn shops in Las Vegas. And, she's the one who says this one book was worth $40,000. She was very optimistic about the future of the book trade, of the antiquarian book trade, in spite of the fact that the internet has taken such a huge bite of it. I think I wrote down the quote she said was, one of the things about the internet is that it creates accessibility, it creates more opportunities for diversity, and it lessens things like gatekeeping. That's one thing I came away from this documentary about, the idea of gatekeeping. They spent some time at the Groliers, the private book library in New York City, which didn't allow women in until the last 25, 30 years. That's an example, I think, of how what she meant by gatekeeping. But now, it's obviously made that whole trade a lot more democratic, although when they spend time at the New York International Antiquarian Book Fair at Park Avenue Armory, that wonderful building, it still seems like everything is going strong there, but you also get a sense that this is probably the last generation of this type of people. It's very much, they mentioned earlier that, they asked one person who was a 3rd generation book buyer, why is he still in this trade? And he mentions he got into it through nepotism. One thing you come away from this documentary is that some of these people are 3rd or 4th generations, and they're born into it, and then they just dearly love it. And they love everything about it. And as someone who my whole life, I've been collecting books. I don't know if you can see this over here. I have one bookshelf there, which is comprised entirely of Alfred Hitchcock books. So I know about, the idea of trying to find rare copies, and it's become a lot easier now with the internet. One last quotation I'm going to read to you before I open it up for you guys. My favorite character in this documentary was that guy I mentioned earlier, Dave Bergman. He's the one who opens up the enormous book that has not, what was it? The hair of not a dinosaur, but someone will have to chime in later on and tell me what it was. But it was the book where he opened up and he had like a 6-foot pullout of a fossil fish. And he deals with these books and obviously makes a living out of it. But he had a great quotation that I identified with, and I'm sure my friend Stephanie Dempsey, who I see over there, will identify with this also. It says, the world is divided between people who collect things and people who don't know what the hell these people are doing collecting things. And, either you get it or you don't. And those who enjoy this movie, The Booksellers, obviously get that obsession and how it's so important to people. I just want to say one last thing, that they talk about the fact that, earlier 20, 30 years ago, if you wanted to build your entire collection of first edition Edith Wharton books, it took you years to accrue. You'd have to go through a dealer, or you go to estate sales, or you go to library sales. And sometimes you would hit the jackpot and you would come across, gold. Now it's obviously a lot easier. You don't have to do that. You just touch a few keys on your computer on eBay and you can find it. So it's a double-edged sword. You can see how that sense of adventure is dying out. But, there's also something to be said for instantaneous purchasing. If you find what you've been looking for and someone has it in Montana, you can buy it. So, this documentary leaves me with mixed feelings about that type of life. But, as a book lover and as a bookstore lover, this was right up my alley. And as I mentioned, I was delighted that they spent some time at the Argosy Bookstore. I have other things to say, but I don't want to hog up the whole conversation. Does anyone want to chime in and ask, or this documentary probably is not so much the type of documentary where you're going to ask me questions, because I know about as much about this antiquarian book trade as you do from the documentary. I think probably more people might want to share their own story or give their impressions about the documentary. But if you do have questions about Thomas Berger, I'm here to answer it. Anybody? Jay, should I keep talking?
You just keep an eye on the chat. People are putting things in the chat there. So if you open the chat window.
Yeah, there are some questions and comments in
chat window.
Sam.
Yeah.
Under chat?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see the chat window.
Yeah.
This is my, okay, it's been a while.
We went over this on Tuesday.
Sam, what's your favorite used book you've ever bought? Where did you get it? Well, that's from Stephanie. I have purchased so many used books. I'll tell you, I can't think of my favorite one, but I came across, do you remember the documentary or the scene in the documentary where the guy picks up the book? It's called Amish Love. That's not the one. But I found something just as bizarre. I would like to see what that photograph is, by the way, that he wouldn't show us. But I have found some weird stuff at the Strand Bookstore. I found a book in the early 80s that I still have about the history of spontaneous combustion. People who suddenly explode into flames. People used to believe in this. Maybe it's true, I don't know. But the book, left me a believer. I also found a book at the Strand on the history of lycanthropy, the history of werewolves. So, anything you're looking for, it's typically there, but the best things you find at a bookstore like the Strand are things you're not looking for, that you come across quite accidentally. I mean, I didn't go into the Strand looking for a book on werewolves and spontaneous combustion, but that's part of the great thing about bookstores like that. You will walk away with postcards of the Hoover Dam that you had no intention of buying. I'll probably never use these, but you know, maybe that's the big difference between going to a bookstore and purchasing on the internet. Whereas in the internet, you're specifically looking for a particular book, you know, and that's great. But part of the wonder of a bookstore like the Strand is that you're going to find things that you had no intention of. No, it's like flipping through an encyclopedia, which people never do any longer because there's no such thing as an encyclopedia. But when you used to flip through an encyclopedia to look for a particular thing, you would come across at least 15 or 20 other things in that same volume that you became fascinated with that were more interesting than the thing you were looking for. That is lost, basically. We've lost that sense of surprise. But, you know, so I hope that answers your question, Ms. Dempsey. And if you ever want to know about spontaneous combustion, which is an important thing in this pandemic, I'm your man. Oh, mammoth. Someone just wrote in the word mammoth. That is the hair that was in the book that Dave Bergman had, the hair of the mammoth. Can you tell us a little bit about the filmmaker? I'm not familiar with the filmmaker. I know that he's an editor primarily. And I read an interview with him in Publishers Weekly, and he said that, well, actually, he said something very interesting. He said that this is a documentary that would never have been made unless he had a friend who was very, very well ensconced in the antiquarian book trade and who introduced him to these people who are somewhat protective of their profession and their secrets. And they actually don't like, they're not comfortable being interviewed about these jobs they've been doing for 30, 40 years. But because he knew somebody who got him in, he was able to make the documentary. I think it's actually a really well-made documentary. I mean, you could quibble that he spends too much time in New York City, but you know, New York City is the heart, I think, of this trade. He does spend some time in London. He does spend some time in Connecticut with that guy who has that incredible library, the history of the human imagination. That it was the library that's shaped like an Escher picture. I was wondering, how does he afford to create that private library? And then I read that he's the founder of Priceline, so that explains that. I also enjoyed the interviews with the three famous people. I love Fran Lebowitz. Anything Fran Lebowitz says is worth listening to. But it was great to have Susan Orlean and Gay Talese also in it. By the way, did any of you guys watch the end of the credits? Yeah. Do you usually turn off at the very end of the credits, Fran Lebowitz comes back on with a story about lending a book to David Bowie that she never got back. It was very funny. So let's see. The movie score was great and original. I was curious about how global the marketplace is in the international sections, Asian literature. You know, I'm not sure about that, but when I read about your question about Asian literature, I'm thinking about that one bookstore in Queens that on one side is Mao propaganda, and on the other side is original Maurice Sendak illustrations. I would say that bookstore has a niche. You're either there for the Mao propaganda or the Maurice Sendak, and obviously they've made a go of it. I guess you come away from this movie realizing there's always someone who's going to buy it. You know, whatever you're selling, someone will buy it. But whether you can make a living of it is another matter. Oh, you're right. Some person said, I wish he'd identified the people he was interviewing. That's true. He does when he focuses time on a particular person, he'll give the first name like Dave or Rhonda. But a lot of the interviews with other people don't have identifications, which I thought was kind of odd for a book about reading. But yeah, that was one minor quibble I had with it. There's a lot of comments here. Let's see. The opening scenes of the antiquarian booksellers market were shot at the Armory on Lexington and 25th Street, which was the scene of the famous 1913 Armory art show, which was the first time Americans were introduced to the art of Picasso. And yeah, I actually thought that Armory was higher up on the Upper East Side near my alma mater, Hunter College, but there is another Armory up there, but it's not the same Armory, I guess. I skipped Eric's question. Let's see, Eric. I don't see Eric. Eric, do you want to open it up to Eric, Jay? Eric Whiteside.
The question actually comes from my much better half. I'm hoping that she will get interested in book collecting to complement all the books I brought into our marriage. But she was wondering, is there any rough equivalent in Charlotte, or how far from Charlotte do you have to go before you can find something without going all the way to New York City?
I'm gonna bring in my friend. I have a friend, Stephanie Dempsey, who's married to the great writer Jeff Jackson. They go to a lot of used bookstores in North Carolina that I'm not familiar with. I think Asheville was the answer to your question. There seems to be a great market for used bookstores in Asheville. There's a
great bookstore in West Asheville called Bagatelle Books. That's phenomenal. It's not big, or it's not like a warehouse, but it's new and it's wonderful. And the guy who runs it, Patrick, is awesome. He's a young guy, it's nice to see a young guy in the trade. Also in Wilmington, North Carolina, there's a store called McAllister and Solomon, which has wonderful used books, also run by a guy that worked for the public library in Wilmington and his partner. Those are the two, I think, best used bookstores in North Carolina. There used to be one in Salisbury called the Literary Book Post. That's changed hands. It's changed hands a couple of times, so it's a shadow of its former self.
What about Stephanie? What about here in Charlotte?
Book Buyers.
Is that the one on Central Avenue? That's a great one.
Yeah, Book Buyers is it's the closest thing that we have. I would say.
There used to be a great one on Franklin Street in Chapel Hill. I don't know.
Oh yes, still there. I think it's closed. It's closed.
Oh, that's terrible. Yeah. That's terrible. You mentioned young people. I loved what Fran Lebowitz said in the documentary, that when she's on the subway, she notices more and more younger people in their 20s reading books instead of their phones. And she thinks it's, they're treating books possibly like the way people treated LPs a few years ago, before LPs came back in a strong way as a sort of retro thing. I know that's a little far-fetched, but that was interesting. And, that's an optimistic thing that she took from it, that, books are never going to go away, hopefully. But I like that part. I liked any part with Fran Lebowitz. Any other questions? They showed some clips early on in the movie from movies with bookstores. They had that scene from that Anthony Hopkins film, Charing Cross Road.
88 Charing Cross Road.
That was great. And what was the movie that came out recently by Todd Haynes, Stephanie? It takes place in the 70s.
With Melissa McCarthy and Richard Grant?
No, not that one. The one about the little boy who goes to New York City.
Oh my God, I love it. Let me look it up.
Well, there was a movie recently that was filmed in New York. It took place in the 70s.
The 70s.
And the bookstore that he goes into is a real bookstore on the Upper West Side. And when I was in New York last summer, I can't remember when, everything is a fog right now in this pandemic. I don't even remember what yesterday was, but I remember the last time I was in New York, I accidentally went into that same bookstore that's in that movie that played at the Manor. Shout out to Brad. Brad, what's the name of that movie?
Wonderstruck.
Oh, Wonderstruck. That's a great movie, by the way. And I went into this bookstore and I thought to myself, this looks familiar. Was this in a movie? And I asked the girl working there, and she said, yeah, they filmed Wonderstruck here because they wanted the idea of a bookstore of the 1970s. And would you know it, that I walked out of that bookstore with another signed copy. See, I'm a collector also of a Ross McDonald Lou Archer mystery from the 1960s. I didn't go in there looking for that, but that's the problem with these places. You know, it's a money pit, and definitely a double-edged sword. You worked, okay, from Tim Funk, you worked at a library. What is the role of libraries in preserving printed books and rare books? Well, I don't think they do. That's another Zoom meeting entirely. But yeah, libraries go through it all the time. And I will say this, that as the main library is getting ready to close and reopen in a few years, they have been having a book sale every day where they're trying to jettison a lot of their older books. And that's a shame, of course, but it's a boon for book collectors. And I have found some great stuff, as well as old magazines. That's why this movie spoke to me so much. I felt like I could have been in this film. What's that? Oh yeah, I'm not going to show you. Yeah, I'm surrounded by devastation of stuff that I've collected, but I'm going to keep it just focused on me right now. Yeah, Wonderstruck. Okay, the doc talks to Kevin Young of the Schomburg, which is an archive. I'm curious about the difference between finding a rare book in a bookstore versus seeing it in an archive. How do you think that experience compares? Does anyone want to weigh in on that? Because I know, Eric, I know that you've spent a lot of time in archives, and you've also gone, I think it was University of Texas in Austin, where they had the archive of what David Foster Wallace's papers, and you've done that. And I'm interested in that aspect of it. Can you say a word or two about that?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I spent a month there in the summer of 2011 on a research grant looking at the David Foster Wallace archive. And Wallace's stuff, you don't get like an actual book. It was a different journals and drafts and notebooks and that kind of thing. It's not the same experience as, say, like finding a rare edition of something. But they did have, of course, in that archive, it's called the Harry Ransom Center archive, and it's at UT Austin, University of Texas Austin campus. It's comparable to the Schomburg. It's one of the major archive museums in the United States. The big find for me there, the big sort of like really visceral experience, was they let me look at a handwritten copy, complete copy of Faulkner's Absalom that he wrote. He wasn't happy with the first printing, and so he rewrote it by hand and submitted it, and they had that. And you have this as a book lover and as an English teacher, you have this experience of seeing this incredible work, right? And so I chalk it up as having had that experience. Obviously, no amount of money and whatever's am I going to bring that thing home to me? And I would have to say, Sam and everybody else, I have actually, my wife doesn't believe this, but I've gotten rid of books, and including like most of my signed books. I don't find myself in the sort of collector mode anymore. I admire it. I mean, it's really interesting to hold a first edition Thomas Berger Little Big Man, but I don't feel like I need to walk away with that. And I thought in the documentary, because the filmmaker does talk to Kevin Young, but doesn't do a lot with the difference between, say, going into an archive, which you can do, anybody can do, versus the pursuit and the journey of seeing the thing. I was just, maybe other people have had similar experiences or find archives to be, you know, sort of like, I don't know, mausoleum-like, because you can't, you know, there's going to be no ownership. I'm not walking out of that archive with any of David Foster Wallace or Wayne Faulkner's stuff.
Right.
I was just curious about, I thought it was interesting they were included. I was glad for it, but I just was curious.
I thought that section of the movie was really interesting. I wasn't too familiar with Kevin Young, and I realized I did some research on him afterward, and he's not only an archivist, he's also the director, I think, of the Schomburg, and he's also a published poet. He has 5 or 6 collections of poetry. So I'm interested in him. I also found interesting the time they spent with Reta Gates, the young African-American woman who collects hip-hop ephemera and zines. I'm glad that the movie opened it up. It wasn't just books. I mean, there are other things people collect. And, you know, she made a point that a lot of the history of hip hop has not been digitized, in the sense that these were all zines that identified hip hop in the 80s and 90s, and they were never digitized. So she collects, you know, thousands of these zines and ephemera. And, you know, I was also, speaking of the word ephemera, I'm just fascinated by this documentary. Spent a lot of time, you know, on things that weren't just books, you know, the selling of the original Enigma machine, or a the throne of a Masonic throne. I really enjoy. You know, do you remember the part in Hackensack, New Jersey, where that guy has that huge warehouse of almost 1 million books, and he knows he says there's a story behind every single book and every single shelf. He's the one, by the way, who had the Amish Love book. You know, you can have an entire documentary just about an individual seller. These people are so fascinating. I thought it was a great documentary. Does anyone else have, I know we don't have much time left. Does anyone else have any comments? Oh, someone says, if Hollywood turned this doc into a drama, who would you cast in the main roles? The sister of the softball player, or the young optimist woman? I'm not sure. When we have our next Zoom meeting, I can think about that, but they were great on their own. I find these people fascinating. The fact that, you know, at the very end of the movie, my friend Angel Truesdale mentioned that she wishes they had spent a little more time on that last discussion when he gathers all of these people together around the round table. And they talk about the fact that you can't really make a living out of this. This is more of a labor of love. You can make a living per se, but, you know, the deck is stacked against these people because of the internet, basically, and eBay. And they do it because it's just a devotion and a love to the book. You know, holding the book, the physical book in your hand, you know, means so much more than reading on a Kindle to some people, not to everybody. But, you know, it was interesting to get those people together and to hear their points of view. You know, some of these old guys who've been doing it basically for 40 or 50 years. And then the female partners in Brooklyn who are very, very optimistic about the future of this trade. So you get all points of view. I thought the film did a great job in 90 minutes to cover a lot of material. The last scene reminded me of the final scene in Broadway Danny Rose. Okay, you know, I love Broadway Danny Rose. It's a film I showed at the library a few years ago, back when people used to watch Woody Allen movies. And yes, in the sense that Broadway Danny Rose in that film gathers together all of these old people, you know, people from vaudeville, you know, jugglers and pinball artists, and that's what the movie's about. And yet you do recognize some of these people in this movie, the booksellers, these people who kind of fall between the cracks, but have just a lifelong devotion to their, you know, their bizarre collections, you know, and I can identify with that, much to the detriment of our bank account. Do we still have time?
Yeah, we're good. We're good, Sam. You can keep going.
Well, I'm looking at my notes here. I think I covered most of what I wanted to say. You know, there's one point in the documentary where he said, you know, before the internet, if you were looking to build a collection of rare books, or even, you know, first editions or second editions, whatever you're interested in finding, you would go from vintage bookstore to used bookstore. You can go to auctions or estate sales. You can work with a dealer, you know, and there's something to be said for that. And that's part of the adventure that has been lost in a sense. But, you know, thank goodness some of these bookstores are still making it. You know, I have found things great in bookstores, and I have found things great on the internet. So, you know, I think we're living in a you know, all is not lost. I think that things are pretty positive in that sense. If we ever get out of our houses, of course, you know, we may not go to bookstores anymore. Anyway, feel free to ask again if people want to just, yeah. Does anyone have a comment or anything you want to say about the bookstore, or about the art of collecting and the obsessive nature of this life? Anyone? Oh, okay. Before I go, any recommendations as to must-see documentaries on streaming TV? Someone mentioned Crypt Camp on Netflix, which I know of. I haven't seen it yet. That's good. Is this the one about the kids with disabilities in the 1980s? And some of them went on and became activists and politicians. I've heard that's really great. I look forward to seeing that. I will say that I don't know how many of you guys get the Criterion channel, but I've been watching a lot of long movies. I watched an 8-hour Russian movie called War and Peace that's on Criterion. I would never have done that unless I was trapped in a house for 5 or 6 weeks. But, you know, I am taking care of that. And I'm reading more than I've ever read. I'm halfway through the Pickwick Papers, a book that Stephanie recommended.
What about that bee documentary?
Which documentary?
The Beekeeper.
Oh, yeah. Is anyone, I have a great documentary. I've seen part of it. Has anyone seen Honeyland? About I think it's on Hulu, about the elderly lady in Macedonia who collects bees. I think it was nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary. What I've seen of that is a knockout, if anyone has Hulu channel. Someone just said Honeyland is fantastic. Yeah, Stephanie, we haven't seen that movie yet. I'm looking forward to that. Okay. Woody says it's great also. Someone asked me, did you read The Man Who Loved Books? I'm not familiar with that book. Can someone tell me about The Man Who Loved Books? Has anyone heard of this novel? The Man Who Loved Books? Okay. Let's see, Eric said that there is a hip hop archive at Harvard. Okay, that's good information. I didn't know about that. Anyone else? Let me see if I have any other. What did you guys think of that private bookstore by the guy the founder of Priceland Library of the History of the Human Imagination? I was really impressed by that, but I was also thinking to myself, you know, this bookstore doesn't exist unless this guy is a billionaire. And who is it for, really? Can people buy tickets and go to that bookstore? Is it just for his personal enjoyment? It seemed like a very huge huge private library, but I don't know if anyone actually goes into it. So it would seem, unless he exposes other people to it, it sort of goes to waste. But I was impressed by the architecture of it. Jay says that you can remind people if they are looking for good films. The Film Society has 16 currently in their virtual screening room. Spaceship Earth is a great doc on Biosphere 2 that just dropped on Friday. So I've heard about Spaceship Earth, the Biosphere. What more perfect movie can you watch during the quarantine than a movie about being in a biosphere for a couple of years? Anyone else? It's great seeing everybody again. It's great seeing Jane and Woody and Brad, and I feel like I'm on the Brady Bunch here. Don't forget the the Abel Ferrara recommendations. Okay, that's for the next Zoom meeting also. Brad, should I just keep talking?
We're done when you're done, Sam.
Okay, I've kind of hit the wall here, but I thoroughly enjoyed this documentary, and thanks for tuning in. And if you ever make it to New York City, or when you do go to New York City, please make a beeline for the Argosy Bookstore on 59th Street and see those three sisters who run that place. It really is a treasure, but don't touch any of the Thomas Berger stuff. That's my name on it. So, but anyway, thank you, everybody. It's been great. Hope you get through the next few weeks. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Jay and Sam.
Bye-bye, everyone.